And we don't support either house's approach on the ADA. The Career Technical Education Grant Program that was proposed in the January budget is really meant to transform and update career technical education programs throughout the state, with an emphasis on building new programs, updating existing programs in areas of the state where there's a high dropout rate, and in rural areas of California. This is not a categorical. This is a 3-year proposal. And the idea is that these programs are very expensive to build and also to maintain. And so this additional money is really provided to provide that enhanced amount that's needed to make those upfront investments, but that we expect that these districts will use their LCFF growth monies to sustain these programs over the long run. As you will recall, the LCFF does have an add-on for the 9 through 12 grade span, and that add-on, that additional amount for those high school students was really meant to provide that rich breadth of programs that good high schools do that include strong career technical education opportunities for students.
So when we had this debate in our budget committee, and I did support the Senate proposal, my concern, and what I was most sensitive to, was the argument for assuring equity, that those smaller districts, less resourceful districts that may not have these programs in place and may not be able to compete, may not be able to have access to grant writers so that they can get into the game and access some of these incentive grant programs. I thought it was solid, but upon further thought and discussion with some of those closer to how this operates on the ground, given that the whole concept here is that they are incentive grant programs, that there's money in LCFF already for these, so that if a district is using some of that LCFF to create these programs and get them up and running, and then want to further expand and invest, they can then apply for the incentive grants. That's something on top of what's already provided in the LCFF. That now seems to me to have some real credence to it. So I'm wondering, and I appreciate the LAO compromise, but I was thinking more in a compromise of making sure that we do have an equitable situation for the entire state, those that may be a little more advantaged, those not, but at the same time, and I know that the Senate has some protocols as to ensuring quality programs. Is there a way to maybe beef those up a bit so that we make sure we're not throwing money in the direction that may not be well used, but at the same time making sure everyone has access to their money? Is there a sweet spot to be found there?
The governor's proposal does have more quality indicators. I believe there's 10. So that might be some way to compromise that we add.
I think we had 5 or 6.
Yeah, something like that. So those quality indicators could be included. But I would note that having a whole plethora of quality indicators would be quite administratively burdensome for the applicants for this grant.
More so. So that moves the equity in the other direction. Ms. Bossler?
So I do think that we have to have met with the field and have less concern about the application process, because we do think it will be a simple application. I think another important design feature of our program is the matching funds, because we think career technical education is absolutely a base responsibility for local school districts to be providing, tailored to what the needs are in their region. And that should be funded with their local control funding formula, their base funding. We shouldn't just cordon career tech over to a separate categorical that's all that career tech gets. We really want the districts, and that's part of our requirement on the matching, and that they have a plan for supporting it with their base funds. School districts should be investing in programs that have good outcomes for students, reduce dropout rates, and career technical education is one of the very proven investments that school districts can do. So this program that we've designed with its competitive nature is really meant to allow districts who have wanted to transform their programs or update their programs, expand into a new area, to do that on top of their base investments and to grow their investments in career tech. So that's really our approach. The ADA approach is quite a bit more diluted. Every district would get a little bit, but it probably wouldn't be enough to grow a new program. So that's our concern with the ADA approach.
But Ms. Collins, you disagree with that?
Oh, well, we just had another idea.
Okay. That's what this is all about.
Exactly, of a potential compromise
Yes.
with the governor's proposal. There could be a match provision added to the ADA proposals that the Senate and Assembly have, which might address some of the concerns from the administration about districts not investing their LCFF money in CTE. So you could include that match as well as on an ADA basis. And I would just note that on an ADA basis, for just high school students, it would be, we estimate about $200 to $250 per student, $200 to $250 per student under ADA. So that just gives you a better idea of how much would be going per pupil.
Ms. Bossler, does that get you anywhere?
It would definitely not be nearly enough for a small school district to build a new program, and again, just not the approach that we're going for, the ADA approach. I think it spreads it too thin, and their focus is on really transforming and growing significant new programs that are supportable ongoing by the local school districts.
Thank you. Senator Nielsen.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd be very wary of that ADA approach, and I concur with Ms. Bosworth, having been very familiar with these programs over many, many decades. One good point that is made about Career Tech Ed is Career Tech Ed has embraced excellence in education and standards, and those are important, and that should be built into this. But I would argue that those districts, that they can make good determinations, and the base funding that the governor has offered up, I believe, has kind of helped restore Career Tech Ed to more mainstream and a bit of esteem and the ability to do something. But with a 250 or some kind of limit like that, you cannot grow programs. I think you cannot even sustain them with that amount. I do like the governor's approach a lot better. Maybe we can get a bit of a hybrid, but not to go clear to the ADA, and certainly not to leave out standards, and not to really fetter those districts from establishing what their local priorities are. The local areas do have different career tech needs. For example, some areas may be very important to have agriculture. Some nursing education would be more important.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen.
Yeah, I think clearly the issue of career tech is one that's extremely important and has evolved over time, so that almost the ADA approach is not even feasible or sustainable in any way in terms of a real career tech program. Many excellent career tech programs have partners and all kinds of stuff, so it's a very expensive program. And that's why some districts didn't do career tech when the programs were collapsed and the money went into LCFF. They realized in order to do a real high quality one, it was going to be difficult. The ones who that remained were those who either were very large districts, and then they developed some kind of career tech school with a center, and so used all their money around career tech. So it would be interesting to see, even with $200 a person coming into a high school that's 1,000 students, is not a tremendous amount of money to run a career tech program. I mean, it still takes a lot of resources and equipment and ongoing stuff that's there. So that would be something to be concerned about. I was interested, and however we've come on fall on that, we'll obviously continue the conversation. We had mentioned the fact that these are supposed to be, in some of our language, high-quality programs. And so I wanted to make sure that we basically emphasize that there is and the governor has some standards, and some others have some standards for CTE, so that schools who get the money have to meet these standards that are really very high and expensive. So you want to make sure so even if you did the ADA, it's kind of convoluted, because my assumption is people would have to put a plan together and apply to some entity, not sure what that is, in order to make sure that programs of quality in order to get the money. I think that's the general thinking, even if it were done by ADA standards. So I think make sure that our language is clear if we move in that direction, because we're at one point we're saying do it by ADA, high school ADA, but then we're not saying what the process clearly looks like, but we're saying these programs have to be of quality. And too often we say that without all the other administrative pieces in place, and thinking about, okay, well then, if it has to be of quality, who's going to evaluate the quality? And does that quality identification have to exist before the money is allocated, so that you don't just get money and then all of a sudden you discover the program was not of quality? So evidently, even embedded in some of the language that we produced, there is some idea that this still has to be a process that you go through to get the dollars, and that they're just not automatically allocated to every school. So that in itself is somewhat problematic as we kind of look at this program and we move forward as to how we're going to fall for all of us to think about.
To be continued.
Obviously.
Thank you. And Ms. Collins, thank you for your creative thinking. I encourage.
And Mr. Cabral.
And Mr. Cabral, thank you. We want even more. Moving on to technology infrastructure, high-speed network.
In recognition that there are some areas of the state that are still not well covered by broadband infrastructure like our urban areas, we built $100 million into the January budget that built off a $26.7 million investment last year to really ensure that the districts around the state are well prepared for the new computer-based testing that is part of the Common Core, and to upgrade their backbone infrastructures to support the technology needs that modern schools have.
Okay, any comments? I know the Senate has reduced the amount. Is discussion concerning that?
Yes, the Senate has proposed reducing the amount to $75 million and some placeholder or some trailer bill to disperse the funds in a somewhat different manner. The Assembly has approved as budgeted. The Senate proposes with $45 million of the $75 million to go towards a general technology block grant that would provide funding for technology-related purposes at all schools. We think that this would provide flexibility to schools to make technology-related purposes that are necessary for them to best serve their students. The Senate proposal also includes $25 million for the same purposes that the governor and the Assembly have put forth for broadband infrastructure improvement. We think that this is enough funding towards the same, because there's only about 50 schools that remain that would be able to apply for this money, about 2,000 test-taking students. So we think that $25 million is definitely enough funding towards this goal. The Senate also proposes $5 million for technical assistance to help schools and districts maintain their internet infrastructure, make long-term decisions, and access subsidies to help them deliver internet to their students. We think this is laudable. It was pointed out by multiple stakeholders that technical assistance is a real need at schools to just know how to administer internet. The last difference between the Senate and Assembly proposal is that there be a report on middle mile connections. This is just a segment of the internet that we as a state may want to invest further in, but we need a little bit more information to know if we want to put further investments towards this part of the internet. Thanks.
Is there any discussion from the governor's position as to what this other $25 million, since the Senate has reduced the amount?
Yeah, we don't. We have some difference of opinion about whether the 25 is enough. I think that the initial assessments were done with the practice tests, which are being refined, and once we have the full testing requirements, we'll need to make sure that the the infrastructure is robust enough to support that. So that was really our basis for the $100 million estimate. It is an estimate. We don't know for sure if there will need to be less or more, but the $25 million seems low to us. The other thing, on the $45 million to provide grants to local education agencies for just general technology needs, I would say that we think there's a significant amount of one-time resources in the mandate backlog grants that are going out to districts, and technology is certainly one of the one-time expenditures that many districts around the state are investing in with their one-time resources. So we don't think this additional $45 million, which is frankly pretty small in the scheme of things, would be necessary.
I would just note that $100 million is excessive when we're considering that we've identified about 50 schools that would still be applying for, would still meet the priority to even apply for these grants. That's a huge per pupil amount. We think it's excessive. In fact, most of those schools could be served within the funding from the first year of the broadband infrastructure improvement grants, that $26.7 million that was mentioned earlier. They would just be using a different type of internet that would still allow them to administer the tests, but wouldn't be kind of the Cadillac, the most expensive way to deliver internet to the schools.
Thank you, Ms. Collins. So you're suggesting the $100 million may be excessive. Our staff notes that $25 million might be more reasonable. Do you have a price tag on it yourself?
We don't. We, in the past, have recommended setting a maximum per pupil amount that the legislature might be comfortable with providing to allow students to take the test. If we were to provide the average of the first round of the broadband infrastructure improvement grants and apply it to the remaining students that we've identified, it would be more around the tune of $2 million. But we recognize, as Ms.
$2 million statewide.
Yeah, yes. But as Ms. Bosler mentioned, there are some schools that are still being identified. As of subcommittee hearings in early May, they had identified 4 more schools that had not come up in the first round. So there may be some really high need schools to be identified. But we, as far as the 25 versus 100 million, we believe the 25 will definitely be sufficient.
And could there be wisdom in using some of the remaining funds, not necessarily up to 100 million, but for training and technology needs in some of these areas?
Yes, the training, I think we need to think whether we want short-term or long-term. Some of the needs that have been identified have been more staffing issues, that there's very few technology positions within districts and schools. But the technical assistance on a one-time basis could definitely help districts and schools do what they can in the short term until they're able to hire staff.
Councilman Bloom.
Perhaps LAO can help me understand why there's what seems to me to be a fairly narrow focus on test taking when technology connectivity has so much broader implications for student success today.
The governor's proposal was the second round of a broadband infrastructure improvement grant proposal that the state adopted last year, and that was just the focus of that money was for Common Core implementation, specifically Common Core implementation as it pertained to the Smarter Balance assessments, so the online test taking. The tests that we are adopting now require an internet connection in order to administer the test. So I think the state thought this was their responsibility. We need to ensure if we're telling schools they need to do Common Core, we need to ensure that they can give the tests. Beyond that, digital learning writ large, I think the state has viewed that more as a local decision, that they can use their local control funding formula to purchase those kinds of those speeds if they wanted to do digital learning, if they're not already.
Seems to me that if we're putting money into a pot to create this kind of connectivity, we're losing an opportunity, certainly for efficiency's sake, to go the distance and provide what's necessary for broader use. Now, I can't tell from what we have in front of us whether this baseline amount of funding provides that utility, but I would think it's pretty important and that it's penny wise and pound foolish to say, well, you know, we won't spend the extra increment of money because they could use LCFF money for that.
I would just note that if that were the case, then the legislature might want to change the intent and set specific baselines for how the money would be used, because there's needs all over the state and there's been different priorities around the state. So we want to be careful that we're not awarding funding to districts that just have prioritized something else and not technology. So kind of rewarding bad behavior, so to speak. So the legislature, if it did want to put that money towards just improving connectivity overall, we could work with staff to set certain baselines for what types of schools would have access to this money, what are the speeds that we want to get every school up to, et cetera.
I would just note on the $2 million figure that the LAO threw out, I think that it's important to note that the connectivity of the broadband nature that we're talking about, it's not going to be the same cost for every widget, because some schools are very remote, some schools may be in urban areas where there actually is not a lot of broadband area because of the neighborhood they're in. There are a lot of unique situations, but it's not, it doesn't really lend itself to a per unit calculation because every circumstance is so different. And in our view, the first year, some of the lower hanging fruit, the easier connections were made. This next round, we anticipate have more technological challenges and more geographic challenges. And so, you know, that's part of how we built the $100 million into our estimate.
Very good. Senator Nielsen.
Well, Ms. Bosler made the answer that I was going to inquire further. A lot of areas are really very underserved with the broadband now, all over California, and that's kind of what I hear you talking to in terms of needing that flexibility for those areas. Is that correct? Because those capital costs to get to some areas are very, very high.
I would just note that again, it's just the 50 schools, and 47 of them can be addressed. The K-12 high-speed network and CDE has indicated that 47 of those schools can be addressed with last year's money to give them speeds fast enough to take the test. If our goal is for them to take the tests, we could address the majority, the vast majority of remaining schools within last year's allocation. It would just be with a different type of internet speed.
I might suggest that we have a lot of disagreement about facts, and maybe we should all have the get together and report back to you on this.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Page 10 is home to school transportation. All right, LAO, sorry, we are approaching 1 o'clock, and as forewarned, we're going to have to attend to some floor and caucus business. So if it's agreeable with everyone else's schedule, we can be back here at 2 o'clock sharp. 2 o'clock sharp, agreed upon. All right. So sorry for the inconvenience. Everyone gets to have a little lunch break. We'll see you at 2. Getting some of our floor work done simultaneous to our conference. Thank you for your patience with us. We're going to continue on page 10 of education, home to school transportation. Governor and Assembly had no proposals, so Mr. Cabral, if you'd like to share with us, or your companion. I'm sorry, your name again, sir?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kenneth Capon with the Ledge Analyst's Office.
Welcome.
Thank you. So as you said, the governor and the Senate had no proposal. The Senate had a proposal to spend $50 million to provide school districts and county offices of education with a cost of living adjustment for their existing pupil transportation programs and to begin equalizing funding levels across the state. I'd be happy to provide more background if that would be helpful.
And this also will conform to our 98 package. And I believe Senator Block has or had a proposal, SB 191?
I believe that's right. I'm familiar with the bill.
And is that this year?
Yeah, that's in committee. I believe it just cleared appropriations a few days ago.
Very good. Ms. Bosler.
Yeah, so the home to school transportation categorical was added to the LCFF formula when we implemented LCFF. So that was created as an add-on. So we would be opposed to creating a new categorical outside of LCFF and prefer the local flexibility that we have with LCFF.
And would you recognize that there probably is a need for a cost of living adjustment, which this would serve the purpose of?
So the beauty of LCFF is that it's flexible money. So if a district determines that a cost of living adjustment is needed for transportation workers in the transportation area, that is something that can be decided at their local board.
Right. So
One quick question. This is for currently existing programs that exist, right? And are they district employees that we're talking about? So do they fall in the same category as all district employees to get cost of living or whatever kind of raises they get? I wasn't sure if these were outside the normal group or generally I know when we've had transportation, the people are district employees, classified employees, so that when the classified union negotiates a salary increase, everybody kind of gets it. So, or is this a separate body, a separate entity that's not in that group? I was trying to figure out why this was pulled out.
Yeah, I think this was actually about equalizing funding. When we we folded the formula into the LCFF, we actually treated it slightly different. We did that with a few of the old categoricals where we kept the allocation at the same level and just added it on to the base formula. So I think this is to provide funding to other districts, specifically for transportation. And so that approach we just are not supportive of because we prefer to put the money in through the LCFF lens. And then there's the local flexibility to fund transportation if that's a high priority or other expenditures.
So this would actually fund other beginning transportation programs, is that correct? Or, I mean, at one point it talks about cost of living, and then you're saying expansion of the transportation program?
We haven't seen all of the language that the intent is behind here. I was mainly just reacting to what was written here, but some of the money could go to growing the existing districts that currently receive. I mean, all of it is LCFF now. But I mean, I think people are kind of going back several years and saying, well, this is how much I got when we had a categorical. And they're seeking to equalize transportation funding, so providing more money to those districts that didn't have as much under the old formula.
Okay.
Maybe the LAO has something.
I think that's, to your question, I think that's one of several issues to be worked out in the trailer bill. I don't think it's yet clear what would happen for districts that have historically been excluded, kind of how the equalization funding would be allocated. There's this transportation funding is now this component of the LCFF. I think there'd be some technical issues just making that component work with a new system. So I think, one observation we have is there are a lot of issues that would need to be worked out in a very short period of time for this proposal.
Are there any, maybe this is just 50 million, but are there any districts identified or that would get this money? There are? No?
There aren't any specific districts. It would be the formula to allocate the funds is still to be developed, I think.
That's correct. We haven't seen specific language of how the funding would be allocated at this point, although the existing add-on is allocated to approximately 1,000 LEA, so it's possible that the funding could go to those existing, or it could be used for LEAs that don't get money. Just would be outlined specifically in whatever language is developed.
Mr. Chairman.
How did we arrive at the 50 million then? Or how did, I should ask the Senate, how did we arrive? Because I'm wondering if this is enough money, or how many people it covers, or are we dealing with a special need, or, I don't know.
So I can take a first shot at that. District spent about $1.4 billion on pupil
Right.
transportation in 13-14. The existing add-on is about $500 million. So if the goal of this proposal was to bring everyone up to say 50% of 50% level of reimbursement, the cost would be $250 to $300 million, something in there, in that range. So the $50 million would be a start towards that direction, but it obviously wouldn't get the state all the way there.
Okay.
Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm a little confused because what I'm hearing, and maybe this isn't what I heard, correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing is that there have been no districts identified that would use this money, but also that this is just a start in funding the need that exists. That's what I heard. So we do have, not necessarily in my district, but I know we have several areas of the state where this transportation is very much needed. Otherwise, these kids aren't going to get to school. And so the districts are eating the cost for that. So I would argue that you may not be aware of the names of the districts, but that the need does indeed exist. And just would ask that if it's possible, if we could get a little more detail on where this need exists. You know, some names, some geographical locations, if that's possible.
So I would just reiterate, our approach is about local flexibility, and districts absolutely have incentive to make sure students are coming to school because they're funded for the days that the student is at school. And so to the extent that transportation is an important part of their regional ability to get students to school, we would assume that they're using their LCFF money to fund transportation because that's a really critical component of their school program. But the approach has been, by this administration, to really focus on putting money through the LCFF formula, which gives districts the maximum flexibility in order to make those choices at the local district level. So we would not support creating a new categorical specifically targeted to transportation because the money already exists and is going out to the districts. It's just that they have choices that they can make at the local level about how they spend that money.
All right. Page 11 is foster youth services. This time it's the Assembly that has the proposal. Thank you, Mr. Kaplan. Ms. Chu, welcome back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Carolyn Chu from Legislative Analyst's Office. So the Foster Youth Services Program is one of the remaining categorical programs that the state has on the education side after the establishment of the local control funding formula. The current program is about $15 million, and it goes to some county offices and a few school districts to provide services to foster youth students who are not placed with relatives. The Assembly passed a proposal to expand the definition of foster youth under the program to be expansive and include all foster youth and increase the funding correspondingly. The Senate took no action and the governor had no proposal on this issue. We recommend the Senate, as under LCFF, districts and county offices are receiving funding for all foster youth, irrespective of placement, and districts must increase and improve the services for those students in correspondence with the funding that they receive for them, and must describe how they're going to do so within their local control and accountability plans.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Assemblywoman Weber, you have a bill on this.
Yes, we do. This is obviously a very important bill passed our House this morning, but it primarily focuses on the fact that what we did last year in the budget was to encourage the increase of young people moving into homes with their relatives. and equalizing the funding. And then once we did that, we realized that that has some limitations because children who live with their relatives don't get all the same social services and programs than support that kids who don't live with their relatives get. Additional support and tutoring, counseling, those kinds of things. And so we had no idea that would be a disadvantage for students. So this kind of equalizes the support services for young people that as regardless whether they live with relatives or with their family members. They oftentimes have the same kind of issues, social issues, academic issues, because they may have been behind in school because of the instability of their home, just a host of things that are there. So we see this as a fairness issue as we continue to try to address the issue of foster care, make sure those kids are not behind academically. So.
Ms. Chu, with regard to youth who are living in relative foster care, can they benefit from LCFF dollars for the very services that the Assemblywoman just mentioned, the
Yes,
tutoring,
they
the mentoring?
can. Yes. Under the local control funding formula, funding is provided to foster youth irrespective of placement. So they can receive those same types of services from either the county office or the district. The issue here being that the county offices cannot use the foster youth services program dollars to serve those students, but they can use their LCFF dollars to serve those students.
Yes, Assemblyman Bloom.
Thank you. I just want to add a comment here because I think throughout the budget we see some opportunities for adding additional dollars when it comes to foster youth. Youth from the ages of 18 to 24 make up around 10 to 15% of the homeless population. Foster youth is a really big component of that percentage. And it also, that cohort is the most rapidly increasing percentage within the homeless population. So we have an opportunity with this budget in a number of places, and this is one of them, to really take a step forward on homelessness. We have some housing issues that are part of the budget and part of the legislative package as well. But I think we have an opportunity now to really step up on this issue in a way that the state hasn't been able to over the last few years. So I don't want to make these comments at every juncture. They're really applicable across a large number of the budget allocations and categories that we're looking at.